Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Revenue Lounge. I am your host, Randy Likas, and in today's episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Andy Raskin to the show. Andy is a consultant and advisor whose specialty is helping CEOs and leadership teams craft a single high-level story, something he calls a strategic narrative, that powers success and aligns the entire company around something bigger than just the features and functions of their product. He's helped founders and CEOs at companies like OneTrust, Uber, Dropbox, Square, IBM, and many others. Andy, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Randy.
So, Andy, I actually got first turned on to your work when I heard you speak as a keynote at a Pavilion event a couple of years ago in Nashville. And I just fell in love with what you had to say, really became inspired. Since then, I've become a huge fan. I've read a lot that I can, but I'm super excited to have you share your story and your wisdom with our audience. One of the things I usually like to ask and open things up is maybe you can start by telling us a little about maybe your career journey and your background. How'd you get into this line of work and start helping companies think through their strategic narratives?
Sure. First of all, thanks for letting me know you were there at Pavilion. That was a really great show. I really enjoyed that, and I talked with a lot of people there. And also, I saw a lot of great presentations there. So it's just a lot of great learning. So my career, I started out as a software engineer. I was a computer science major undergrad, and it was a few years after I got out of school. I was a coder, and a colleague and I had an idea for an app. So this is like late 90s, and so it's like Windows app. So we code a prototype, Visual Studio, and we put it out on the internet, which was starting, and we got some users, and we thought, okay, well, maybe this could be a business. And so we wrote a business plan. I wrote the business plan and sent it out. We sent it out to a bunch of VCs, and the reaction was really bad. And one of them wrote back like, "Listen, Andy, I rate every business plan I get on a scale of 1 to 10, and yours is a 1." And then in parentheses, he wrote worst, in case we thought 1 might be the top of his scale. No. And then he wrote, this is when they would print it out and mail it back to you. So he wrote in the margin, "Not a compelling story." And I didn't really pay much attention to that. We were just crushed by just not getting any good response. But then a few weeks later, I was walking by this Barnes & Noble in New York where I lived, and there was a sign in the window that said, "For anyone who wants to tell a great story." And, that's me. And then there was an arrow pointing to these books, and the books were about screenwriting, which I knew nothing about. And so I read these books, and the first thing I learned from these books was that a movie is a pitch. If you think of the classic Star Wars, on a basic level, it's like, okay, there's a problem called Darth Vader that has to be solved. But on a higher level, it's really a battle of worldviews. It's a battle of the Darth Vader representing hey, I'm the power, which is often the villain in like these superheroes. I'm going to be all powerful and I don't care about other people. And Luke, on the other side, he starts out that way. He's like a teenager. He's complaining, "I don't want to do my chores and stuff." But he has to become this person who really cares about other people. And then that battle of worldviews is, if you look at it that way, it's a pitch for trust the force, be good to people, those things. But of course, it's delivered in a totally different way from the way I was taught to pitch, which is basically, "Hey, you have a problem. I have the solution. Let me tell you why it's really great." And the question then is, we're not building a 3-act screenplay when we're going to pitch someone. So what applies? What doesn't apply? This was where I started asking those questions. And anyway, we rewrote our plan and we got money and started getting interest. And eventually we had a term sheet. And then, long story short, other CEOs started hearing about this over the years. And I started getting asked to, "Hey, could you help me with this?" And it took about maybe 13, 14 years before I actually wound up saying, "Oh, maybe I could do this as a career." But that's how it started.
That's fascinating. And were you a movie buff before you picked up the screenwriting books? Were you a movie buff at all before you picked that up?
No, I mean, I liked movies. I took a movie history class once in college, but it wasn't like I was a big film person or whatever. I always liked making little videos. Like I made a video in elementary school. Somehow we got a video. It must have been like the first video camera ever made when I was in elementary school. I liked doing that stuff. But no, I didn't know about the theory of film or filmmaking at all.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, around what year was this?
So this was late 90s. When we got funded, I think was 99. So
Right.
It was in a couple of years leading up to that.
And so you say it was like maybe 13 or 14 years before you started like consulting with CEOs. And I think if I understand correctly, you were doing a lot of writing online, and it was the greatest sales deck I've ever seen, right? Which was something you posted on Medium, I think.
That was a few years out. That was, so I probably started doing this work where, so at first I had a bunch of career things that you probably, like, it's just too complicated to even go through. A journalist for a while. I was like, did a bunch of things. But I wound up getting into tech marketing, and I was selling myself as like an interim CMO and I had a couple of roles where I did that for a year or so at each company. And one of the companies, at the end, the company was acquired. And I said to the CEO, would you say it was worth what you paid me to this role? And I was trying to look for a testimonial, whatever, understand my value. And he said, yes. He was 23 years old, by the way, Justin Yoshimura, but totally honest. And I said, well, if I had come, and I said, could you sum it up? And he said, well, sum up my value. And he said, well, you got our story straight. And I said, if I had come to you in the beginning, because from this history of doing that, of reading the screenplays, I'd always thought maybe that could be a career where I help leaders do this. But I just didn't think that any leader's really going to pay for that. Work on our story, So I said, if I had said from the beginning, I'm not going to be your interim CEO, I'm going to help you get the story straight, would you have paid for the? He said, yes. I said, I don't really believe you. And so this was a YC company, and he wrote a note to the YC founders list. And it was like, hey, here's how we were struggling to tell this story. And then other founders are reaching out. And that became the first projects where I was like, I'm selling myself as that. And I realized that there was a need and a market for that. And then it was after a couple of years of doing that I wrote that post you're talking about. It's called The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen. What happened was one of those early clients, the head of sales, had worked at Zuora. And he said, hey, your approach that you're talking about, this like movie, sounds very much like what we were doing at Zuora. And he said, let me show you my sales deck from when I worked there. And I looked at it and was like, wow, this is exactly how I would structure it. And so I wrote that post breaking down that sales deck in terms of the movie or story structure framework. And people really responded to that. That post has, I don't know, 2-3 million views now.
And it still lives on. At least after I saw you speak and I went and read the article, there was people commenting on it even as recent as a couple of years ago. So
that's cool. Yeah. It'll be 10 years old in about 6 months. So it's lived on somewhat. Yeah.
I'm curious, is there anything from that original article or post that you had made having the benefit of hindsight over the past couple of years that you would change?
Oh, I've definitely changed things over the years. Like, I don't use the same exact structure. There's words I've learned that, like, some of the way that I talked about things early on, it would send people down the wrong path. Mm-hmm. So you notice, like, I talked about worldview when I talked about the movies, right?
Yep.
For a while, I just talked about change. I think that article says, hey, name the change in the world. Mm-hmm. And I found that worldview, or sometimes I call it mindset, a shift in mindset or worldview, like, helps people zero in on fertile territory a lot better. So there's ways I've changed the language that I think helps people get there a little better, but the basic structure is still there.
Yep. So you use this metaphor, talking about like the arrogant doctor, to describe the challenge I think most companies have when in their messaging and in their pitch. Can you tell us more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's exactly what I said earlier. The way I'd been taught to pitch was essentially like an arrogant doctor. So, hey, you have a pain, some problem. I have the treatment, cure, it's my product or solution, whatever.
Yeah.
And let me brag to you about why it's the best one, and it's better than all those other ones.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I think this approach it's not wrong. Like, it's the way that I think a lot, especially as consumers, I think we're used to being sold. Mm-hmm. That's the structure of a lot of advertisements we see, or whether that's advertisements on TV or in the grocery store, or 30% more, or whatever, But the arrogant doctor kind of runs into problems when things get complex. For instance, one thing is we have lots and lots of competitors all screaming about their greatness, lots of doctors screaming about how their cures are the best. Maybe more so, I think, even when the product itself becomes very technically complex. So it's one thing to say like, hey, our detergent whitens better. I can go home and I can test that. But to say our software is easier to use or this function, we're talking about these vast platforms of thousands and thousands of features. Very difficult, I think, for most buyers to really suss out whose claims are true.
Yep.
And then the last piece, the arrogant doctor struggles, is where the buyer is not simply a consumer, but maybe a group of, I'm really talking about the B2B situation, where the buyer can be 50 people and they all have their own problems and the weight of those problems is different. So how can we even talk about one pain that we solve? And I started to see the limitations of that in some of those marketing roles that I was in and started to think about, maybe this other approach could work better.
Yeah, and I think from just a practical standpoint, we've probably both been on the sides of buying software and bringing in a set of vendors, and everybody's making the same claims, right? They all sound very similar. And to your point earlier, it's like, how do you as a buyer really prove out whether or not you are the world's leading? It's like, I need something more proof than that, right?
Right. And it's almost impossible to give you that. I guess if you're Coca-Cola, it's very clear we have the largest market share or whatever, but in places where it's a little less clear, exactly, it's hard to give that proof.
Yeah.
And so the narrative approach, it comes at it from a totally different way. Instead of leading with the bragging, hey, here's our unique differentiator, here's why we're great. We're going to start talking instead about this shift in worldview that is the reason we built this product, that we built our product in a different way. And what that does is it gets us out of so the archetypal example to make this concrete is Benioff, Salesforce. Benioff, when he comes out with Salesforce, and because already CRM is an established category, or I think they call it, there was CRM, there was Salesforce automation, these two were already there. And the big company in that was Siebel, the huge market share in that world. And he doesn't come out and say, hey, we're better than Siebel in these ways. He very clearly comes out and says, hey, software is over. Meaning that old mindset of we're going to own our stuff, which is, of course, the mindset represented by Siebel, Darth Vader in this case, right? Yep. That's over. There's this new mindset called the cloud. And what he's doing is saying, hey, are you with us? And of course, most people, this is a very blasphemous story at that moment, right? Like it still is to tell software companies and other software is over, right? But it creates this urgency that then people start joining. And then we say, and so when we talk about features, it's all in the context of this bigger story. And we understand why they matter.
Yep. Right? So you alluded to this earlier, I think, when you said with Benioff, software is over. It really gets at one of the principles, I think, that you talk about, which is name the enemy or name the change. And the enemy is not necessarily a competitor. It's the status quo or it's the old world line of thinking, right? What are some of the other building blocks or components that go into a strategic narrative or some of the principles that you follow?
Yeah. So, the enemy in the narrative is never a competitor. The real enemy in Star Wars is not Vader. It's the mindset that Vader believes, embraces, and that he represents. In the same way, we're looking to do that for this. So the real enemy is not Siebel. It is the mindset they embrace of software, right? In that way. Just like in the movies. So there's this great moment in Star Wars early on where Obi-Wan, so Luke's been belly aching about like, hey, I want to go out, I want to have adventures, I want to be a pilot, do cool stuff. And Obi-Wan comes and says, great, I'm going to teach you to become a pilot. Let's go out. We're going to have adventures. What does Luke say? Do you remember what he says?
I don't remember.
He says, don't worry about it. Nobody remembers.
It's been years since I've seen it.
I only know because I use this in some of my talks. And I went back and looked. He's like, you know what? It's getting kind of late. I got to go home. I can't get involved. Who does this sound like? This sounds like the reluctant buyer, right? And you always hear like, hey, you have to make your pitch emotional. But I never really understood, what does that mean? We're not trying to make someone cry. right?
Right.
Or usually, it's not like that, right? So what do we mean? And I think what we mean is what happens in the movie. So at this point, when Luke says that, he's not emotionally connected to the story Obi-Wan is telling. What happens to change that? The Empire kills his aunt and uncle. I think it's his aunt and uncle, and it's implied they're coming after him. And now, up to this point, yeah, he's had his ups and downs, but he sees the future as like, I'm okay. I'll be always okay. Nothing too much. Now he sees real stakes, like probably I'm going to be dead.
Yeah.
Or I could go with this Obi-Wan guy and maybe I have a chance, right? So in a similar way, I think the great narratives show that this shift in mindset is a matter of life and death, that there are really big stakes here. I remember when Benioff introduced Salesforce, like the first big event they had, they did all these things, like they had the signs of no software demonstrating to they're a movement, literally like they're a movement. But inside this expo space, I think it was the Moscone Center, they had cages with software salesmen inside. And I think their crime was they had to do renewals or something. So it was showing, like, this was one comical take on it. Zuora came up later with this whole story about the subscription economy. Hey, it used to be we want to sell things to people. Now people want to buy things. And they said, hey, look at all the winning companies. The companies who are thriving, they're all subscription or subscription-like companies. Look in every industry. In music, it's Spotify. Or in movies, it's Netflix. And this is a matter of life and death. So that's the second piece, where there's a long answer to your question about what are the other pieces. The third piece I call the buyer mission statement. So, okay, in this new worldview, in Star Wars, okay, there's this, in every movie really, there's an achievement that the main character has to reach in order to get to happily ever after. So in Star Wars, they have to destroy the Death Star. They can destroy the Death Star happily, at least until the next movie. So with Zuora, they had this phrase, turn customers into subscribers. So, okay, this is the very simply put, like the buyer mission. And what I love about it is we often think about the mission statement as like a company mission, but that's very self-centered to the company. Is it better to say, well, what's the mission we have for the buyer? Can we sum up that really simply?
Yep.
And that's really hard to do. There's some other pieces, but maybe I'll stop with those three pieces.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you said resonates really well. And I think everyone claims they're customer centric right now, right? They want to understand their customer journeys, but they're so internally centric when they think about their customer journeys. And it's a really difficult thing to do. You started going into it with some other examples, but as of the maybe recent year or two, what companies do you think are doing really well with redefining or redeveloping their strategic narrative? One that comes to my mind is like Slack, right? Slack used to be this internal communications tool, and I think the way they've repositioned is like it's the future of work, right? And how work gets done. But I'm just curious, are there any that you've seen lately that maybe haven't been involved, but you're like, yeah, they're really getting it right?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I was involved with this one, but it's one. But they did something. They've taken it a little further even than what. So there's a company called Turing. So all of the big AI labs are Turing customers, and Turing provides a lot of the team and skills and tools for these labs to advance their models. And earlier on, it used to be that these labs would just source data. Like, hey, does anyone have data that we can ingest into our thing? So they're looking for a data vendor. And what happened is the demands of creating data that's needed, the researchers have to be much more involved and need more of like a partner in developing environments to create the data and all kinds of AI to build the data itself, all this stuff. So they have a great story about how data labeling is dead. Like data label was that old way, or the era when an AI lab could just say, "Hey, we just need some data and maybe some experts, and see you later." And now what's really needed is this research collaboration, this research acceleration partner. And that's how Turing has been talking about themselves. I think that's really interesting. Virtually every company now wants to be an AI company. And the default story of a lot of companies is we're AI for X. But then at first it's great, but then we now have three very well funded competitors who are also AI for X.
Yep.
So now then it starts what you were saying, we're all going to make some claims about how our AI is better than theirs. So I think the successful companies are going as well, okay, how is like what Turing's saying, how have things changed now within the era of AI, right? Or within the era of AI for our industry? And that's where I'm seeing some promising fertile territory with some of the companies I'm working with.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, which is the buying groups, right? And the multiple personas and how the decisions are being made by multiple stakeholders, cross-function, and so on and so forth. If we just think about B2B SaaS world, right? A lot of companies maybe started out with like a single product, and they're trying to move to a multi-product, whether it's through internal innovation or they've made strategic acquisitions.
Yeah.
And in many cases, what this means is that they are having to sell their product to other people that they didn't have to in the past, cross-functional group. So does that mean that the narrative has to change? And I guess how does one construct a strategic narrative in a way that's adaptive?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there are really two triggers when teams seem to come to me. Where it's like where I'm proved wrong that people wouldn't pay for the story. Most of the time I'm proved right, but there are two times. One is it's somewhere around like series, can happen like late A to like C, where the team has been very successful, but one CEO put it this way, he said, we're doing great, but it's all been brute force of the founders. But now, because of the growth targets and the organization growing, I can't be in every sales call and every product discussion. I need to be able to transmit the strategy and what the story of this to everybody. And that's one of them. The second one is what you just said, which is the company has moved from one product or one focus area to many. One team, you mentioned OneTrust, I think, in your introduction. They were one product there, and they bought like 9 companies. So I think obviously the story is going to have to change there. And even when the company doesn't really change the product focus area, the world changes. And that was something that was interesting to me. Like, I used to think, okay, the narrative, it should be good for like 5 or 10 years, because that's how long the Benioff one. I mean, one salesperson told me they're still basically saying software is dead. Is still the basic. That's not true. I mean, Benioff, every couple of years at Dreamforce, he announces a new narrative. This year it was like the agentic enterprise. So a few years ago, some companies I worked with in the past, including actually Turing and OneTrust, came back to me after a couple of years, say, hey, we want to do it again. And at first I thought like, wow, I failed. Maybe I should just offer it for free or something. And they didn't see it that way. They saw it as like their world had changed so much that, and of course, a lot of that was AI, but things within AI or different things, that, hey, the narrative had to shift as well. And so that's been a big learning for me.
I think we're going to see more and more of that. Where the shelf life used to be 5 or 10 years, with all the change that's going on right now, I think that the narrative is probably going to have to be flipped every couple of years.
Yeah, the CEO of OneTrust, Kabir Bardey, he said to me when he came back for the third time, he said, you know what, maybe we should explore some kind of subscription relationship. Okay, great. But yeah, I think people are seeing that, what you're saying.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. I imagine you probably work with quite a few CEOs in your engagements. And I think when it comes time to changing a strategic narrative, they've got to get the alignment. They got to get their whole team bought in. And it's a big change management initiative. How do they go about doing that? We look to align everyone around there. Is that an accurate assumption that they're the visionaries, right? But in order to make this change stick, they've got to get the right alignment. And so I get the first question, and then second one is like, what advice do you give, right, around how to best enable that change?
Yeah. So first of all, yes, you're not wrong. This is a huge challenge for every company. And one of the things when I follow up, so I have my own podcast where I interview CEOs 6 months, a year afterward, and I always feel like it was harder than expected. And very often I'll say, I just had to be on it, to like, it was almost, usually there's an old narrative, like an old way of talking about the company, and it's kind of like weeds have to be rooted out. But the biggest thing I do is try to set them up for success in how we come up with the narrative. So one of the things I do is yes, every engagement I do is led by the CEO, and it's the CEO who's literally spending hours and hours with me as we build a thing. But I ask them to create a small team of leaders. So usually these are leaders from like marketing, product, sales. Sometimes there's a co-founder, a COO kind of person that are giving inputs to the story and then telling the CEO where it sucks. And they're not shy about this. Usually, so in most of my engagements, I first have a session where I get everyone to give all their input, CEO and this small team. And I have this CEO and I work on it for like a week, and then I have the CEO present a draft version to the team a week after the kickoff. I always say this is going to be the low point of our work together, because you can imagine why everyone's going to just crap on it, right? Because the team has given you all these incredible ideas, truly good ideas, but in order to make something simple like software is over, you're going to have to throw out almost all of them, right? So
Yeah.
good news, the team gets to weigh in on what's working and not working. And in my experience, they're always right. Like the CEO might not agree with every nitpick, but the general direction they will agree with and go with. So then the CEO and I go back to the drawing board, and eventually we get it to a place that team feels good. But anyway, having those leaders be a big essential part of crafting it and vetoing parts or whatever, early on, creates champions in them. So that's one big thing. The second big thing is the asset that we choose to build the story in. So one big question is, where are we going to write this story down so that the CEO and the leadership team can proselytize it across the organization? And the traditional answer to this question is, let's put it in a place the world never sees, some internal messaging document. Marketers sometimes call it like a messaging house, or we're going to have our fragment top messages in pillars and blah, blah, blah. And the idea of this is everybody's going to come to this thing and pull messages from it in the future to build something the world does see, website, sales, like whatever. And I found in my career, like, people wouldn't come back to that thing, especially outside of marketing. And even if they did, it was very hard for people to take these fragments of messages and weave them into something compelling. So I experimented, and after a couple of years came to the sales deck as the core narrative asset. And that's controversial because most people see the sales deck as the output of some more fundamental strategic document. And I'm saying, no, let's make it this. And I think this has worked really well, because it forces the CEO to, of course, sales that can't be long. It can't be a manifesto. It's
Right.
got to be like a salesperson can really, and we'll know very quickly if the sales team doesn't think if it's too long or whatever. So it has to happen really quickly. It also is something we can test in sales. And isn't sales the most important channel for the message at first, right? So by starting that way with that asset and with that channel of testing it and improving it, I find that goes a long way to helping the CEO preach that, evangelize that message.
Yeah. Well, if it gets put into this internal hub or whatever you want to call it, and the people can pull some things out, it kind of waters down what you're trying to do, right? If people can pick and choose. I mean, you really want to, if you're going to commit to the strategic narrative, you really need to commit to it. You don't want it to filter in different areas as a watered down message, right?
Right, and exactly what you said. If it's a document internally, it can be as long as you want it to be, pretty much, and you can just go on as long as you want. And like you said, you're leaving other people to do the picking and choosing, the editing. So I'm saying, no, let's force the CEO to do it. It might be 10 or 20% different or 40% different in some cases, but let's see if we can get the CEO to establish some true north that brings everyone together first.
Yeah. When you start an engagement, are there any like artifacts or areas where you start to help understand what is it like today and how are you describing your messaging today, so that we use that as the baseline to now pivot off of? And if so, what are those artifacts that you kind of start with?
Yeah, I always ask teams to just dump on me whatever's going on, not only with them, but with teams that they want to see, that they see as competitors, where they want to have a story that very clearly differentiates them, not by, hey, we're better because of this feature, but the mindset that drives us is different from all of those companies, right? One of the big things, though, of course, I mean, the way they're telling the story now, you asked about that, it's like, yes, I want to understand what's working in that, what's not working in that. Usually I'll ask that. and get an idea, because maybe there's some things we don't want to throw away or we want to make sure we incorporate it in some ways. Usually, almost always there is. The other thing is talking to customers. Whatever questions I ask the team in the kickoff session to get all the input into the story, we have versions of those that will ask customers too. I have the team interview customers because, why did they buy? They didn't buy because, oh, this feature was 3 times faster than that one, or it's something about the fit to them or something. And so the way I like to ask the question is not what do you love about our stuff, what don't you like about our stuff, which is useful information. One question is, how do we change your life? How did this change your life? Sometimes people kind of laugh at that question, but then sometimes people will cry like, oh my God, let me tell you about that,
Is that right?
And then I like to ask, whatever you just described, why is that so important now versus maybe a few years ago? And what I want to get from this question is, I think there are 2 ways to construct a narrative, or that teams do it. One is what I call like a supply side narrative, which is there's a new technology in the world, AI, and therefore you should jump to take advantage of this. That's not a great narrative in terms of urgency. Now we're all seeing the effects. The teams using AI are going ahead, right? So it's a little more effective. But when it first happens, we're like, oh, okay, that sounds nice. Maybe in 5 years I'll adopt that new thing, So the urgency usually isn't there. But when you have a thing like Zuora's subscription economy, hey, look, the winners have already shifted their mindset. Now we have the urgency. So always looking for this shift where we get the stakes. What's happening when we ask the buyer, like, what has shifted in their world?
Yep.
Such that this is very valuable for them, or life and death, or what new way of looking at their work have we been able to facilitate that is so important to them? Now we're hearing about demand side changes. So what is shifting in the world of the buyer that's causing them to demand this? And those I usually find are the best stories if we can get them.
Yeah. Have you found there to be like an emotion that you're trying to pull out or drive a great narrative? Is it fear? Is it hope? Is it longing? Is there an emotion that you have found has been the most successful in different strategic narratives?
I think the biggest one is belonging. And so when I talk about the shift in worldview, when Mark Benioff says, hey, software is over, now it's the cloud. When Jonathan Siddharth at Turing says, hey, data labeling is over, or that just data vendoring is over, now we need this research acceleration era. They're really all pitching a movement, right? And they're saying, hey, the winners are jumping on board here. And I think of course, it's not going to work if it doesn't resonate with the buyer. The buyer has to see it. It can't be just education, right? They didn't know this. It has to be them saying, you know what, software is really a pain to operate and own. And yeah, I have been using some services like Hotmail over the web, and wow, that's pretty easy. I don't have any software. They have to see it, but if they do, then they're really joining. What the company is doing is joining the movement. And that's sometimes people ask me, can you define strategic narrative? I change probably every 6 months, but the one I've had for the last year or so has been, it's a story that shifts the act of selling from the pitching of a product to the evangelizing of a movement. And what are we looking for movement? We're looking for someone to join that and belong to it.
Yeah. I'm curious, when the CEO gets probably his direct reports aligned around this, does RevOps sit at the table, or is RevOps more of an implementer of the idea? And do you think that they should be in the room?
Well, I feel like it's been a couple of years since I was very much connected to what RevOps is, but even then I feel like there was a lot of different understandings of what RevOps is.
Yeah.
So when you talk about RevOps, what is it for you?
The stewards of data across the organization. So RevOps in the old world was sales ops, right? But we know that buyer experience is much more than just about the sales journey, right? It's about the marketing journey, it's about the customer success journey. So it's the orchestration, if you will, across the different business functions.
Yeah, and so your question is, do they need a seat at the table for building this narrative?
Yeah, or are they more implementers of the idea once the narrative has been built? And maybe there's not a right answer. Maybe it just depends, right? And the
Yeah.
culture of the organization.
I think it probably really depends. So when I work with the teams, I ask the CEO to create this small team of leaders who are going to implement it. And of course, we want everybody. There's so many points of view that we're like, well, how could you do it without that point of view? On the other hand, if we have too many people, then it becomes hard to advance and make progress. So there absolutely have been times when CEOs have chosen someone in a role like that, where someone who sees the whole customer journey. Sometimes it's like a person who's like a product marketer, or they can have RevOps titles or kind of sales titles that are in the more data side, like you're talking about. And in some cases, those people come on after the core story is built, and the team will say, hey, what do you think? And they'll say, oh, you know what? Based on this, we should change it. So there's always a kind of rippling out to the broader team, and often it'll change a little bit as it does that from people like RevOps, from input from people like RevOps, but other teams as well.
Yeah. What's the typical journey like to create a new strategic narrative? Is this something that's done in 2 months? Is this something more like a 6-month journey? What does that look like?
So when I was in marketing roles at companies, often consultants would come in and build, they'd often call themselves like positioning consultant or marketing branding consultant. And it would take like 6 months. And by the time it was 6 months, the world had changed. The company had changed, everything had changed, right? So one of the roles I had was at Skype. And this was actually a product manager role. And Skype was really, this was pre-Microsoft acquisition, really into Agile. So everyone got trained in Agile. And so I really drank that Kool-Aid and really felt like, this is the way. And so when I started doing projects, I was like, let's get this thing out there as quickly as possible, not in a big way. So usually when I'm working with teams, my goal is that after 3 weeks, we have something designed. So I'm not the designer. I don't bring design services to my work, but they've designed what the story we built through iterations with the CEO and the leadership team, like I said, that we can now start taking out into sales calls. We're not rolling it out to the sales team. It might be the CEO, depending on the organization, or the head of sales, one salesperson, one or two who are starting to take it out on some calls and then reporting back or sharing gong calls about what's happening. And where the group then is looking at that and changing it based on what we're learning. So that my goal is by around 6 weeks, we're able to feel like, you know what, we have some good evidence. It's never final. We may have to change some things, but we have some good evidence and good feeling like this is resonating. We're getting the nods and sales calls. People are paying attention. Feels good.
Yeah. So I want to transition into what we call the lightning round, which is a little bit more personal than it is about the work. You used the Star Wars example earlier, because I think everybody has seen Star Wars, even though maybe it hasn't been recently. I've also heard you talk about Frozen, and I've got a small daughter who absolutely loves it. And like the old world was marrying into royalty, and the new world is more about yourself and taking care of your family and friends. The question is there a story framework, if you will, that's outside of business that you keep coming back to that influences your work?
Yeah, well, those screenwriting books that I read early on were really the biggest influences to me. And of those, there's one called Story by a guy named Robert McKee. It's super famous. If you've ever, or anyone who's worked in Hollywood or had a dream or like an inkling for a second of working in Hollywood, they have this book. And he breaks down movies into very formulaic, but principles. He's often criticized as being like too formulaic. In fact, there's a movie adaptation where Nicolas Cage plays two roles. And one of the roles Nicolas Cage plays, he's like a devotee of Robert McKee, who's the author of this, who's played in that movie by, I think, Brian Cox. And I could be wrong about who plays him. But anyway, that Nicolas Cage is seen as shallow because he's like too formulaic. But then the other Nicolas Cage comes to appreciate that, I think, in the end, like, hey, I need some structure. Anyway, it's a book written for movie people or writers. Most of the book is not really geared to business people. But the high level points, I think, he makes are really the foundation of the work that I do. And the biggest high level point he makes is what people pay attention to is change. Change is what we're wired, we've evolved to. The temperature changes, the weather. These are things that we are evolved to notice and to start saying, what? And so making the pitch about change really ties right into that.
Yeah. Is there a core narrative about yourself personally that you make, even though you teach this stuff for a living, that you catch yourself through the years?
Core narrative, you mean about like a core narrative?
Like your own personal narrative. Is there maybe one that you make about yourself personally that you'll be aware of or change?
Well, of course, I've been pitching you, and your listeners this entire time on my approach, right? On my approach, which is this strategic narrative, right? And how have I pitched it? I pitched it as a change from the arrogant doctor approach. And I made it about not quite life and death, but winning and losing in terms of companies, right? So whatever I've said today comes from a frame that I've thought a lot about. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but does it?
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you weren't doing strategic narrative work with executives, what else would you be doing with your life?
Well, I love writing. For a number of years, I was producing audio stories for NPR shows like All Things Considered and This American Life, and I love doing that. I still do. I have an underground podcast if anyone's interested. I won't tell my actual, but it's called Chill Beefs, and it's basically people complain about things, and then I set it to music, like house music or things like
Really?
that. Yeah, it's called Chill Beefs, chillbeefs.com. And if I could do that, and nobody's, I think, really listens to that, but if I could do that, I would do that. I think that I love doing that.
I love that. I'm checking it out for sure. Is there like a small daily habit that you have, or maybe a ritual that helps you stay creative or stay grounded?
A couple of years ago, my son started playing the bass, and I played trombone for most of my life, not super seriously, but, in high school and college and a few bands when I was a younger adult. And playing trombone with a bass player, it's a little not awkward. So I decided to learn guitar. So I practiced, and I love it. So I practice guitar about an hour or two a day because I really enjoy it. I stink, but I just really enjoy it. So that really helps keep me grounded.
Yeah.
What about you? I'm curious. Do you have one?
So it's funny. So a couple of years ago, I've always wanted to play a musical instrument or be able to sing, or I'm not good, right? So I read something about how the ukulele is the easiest string. So I went and picked up a ukulele. And
cool.
I mess around with it here and there. I'll pick it up. And when I first got it, I was like addicted, but I stink. But it's fun. And my daughter enjoys it, stuff like that.
Yeah, I just read a book by this guy. When I was in high school, he was like the greatest musician in our high school. And it's all about how he went up to a certain point and then just the pressures of it and whatever. He gave it up, and then he came back to practicing later in life and kind of rediscovered it. The book it's called Practicing by Glenn Kurtz. And it's nice in a way, like me and you, like we're coming to it with just really probably no expectations, or not that kind of expectation anyway. And it can just be really fun.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so Andy, last question, and it's a little thought-provoking, if you will. So when you think about the arc of your own life story, what chapter do you think you're currently in right now?
Well, it definitely feels like I'm getting older, but it definitely feels like it's the post-climax in a good way. We're in the resolution, because I alluded, like I had all these kind of weird career paths that I kept switching between. I could go on forever talking about all the different jobs that I did, and they all seemed unrelated. Producing Japanese TV shows in New York, writer, video editor at CNN, management consultant at Japanese department store. Anyway, they all seemed like they didn't really make sense together. And when I started doing this work, it felt like, oh, okay, now I understand why I had to do those things. And in some way, I feel like I've been able to draw on all of them. So it really has been a really fulfilling stage, I'd say, these last 10 years doing this work.
Well, I mean, your work stands for itself. The companies that you've helped, the success that they've had has been fantastic. If people want to learn more about you, what's the best channel to do that?
So I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I used to post a lot on LinkedIn, a little less so now, but I still post occasionally. And if you want to, so I mentioned my For Fun podcast. It's also fun. I have a podcast where I interview CEOs that I've worked with on how the story is playing out, why they wanted to, what was happening, where they were like, oh yeah, I want to invest in a strategic narrative. What was that about? And that podcast is called The Bigger Narrative. And each episode is introduced by my mom. I send her the interviews ahead of time, and then I ask her, like, what do you think people are going to get out of this? And then she talks about it, and that becomes the intro to the episode.
That's great. I love that. Well, listen, Andy, I just wanted to say thank you again. This has been like really exciting for me because I've been a fan of yours for a number of years. I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with the audience.
Thanks so much for the chance to do it, Randy. And if you wind up using any of this stuff, or if anyone listening winds up using any of the stuff we talked about, I'd love to hear about it. So yeah, let me know.
Sounds great. That's another episode of the Revenue Lounge. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.